Okay, just a quick video really quickly to show you how we are going to take graphics from either the internet or some sort of known source, run them through Illustrator to get our vectors, and then create a cut path or a toolpath in Aspire to allow for our CNC to create our cuts. So we're going to use just a pretty simple industry standard, really known image, the Nike logo here. I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to come over to Illustrator. Now, what I prefer to do is to utilize Illustrator space to match that which is going to be the size of whatever it is I'm working on. So if I'm creating a sign out of a giant sheet of plywood, my width would then be 96.5 if it's a finished grade type plywood, and 48.5 for my height. Create that. And then Illustrator should be creating my new file here. Alright, so now that I've got this artboard in here, this artboard is going to match my entire sheet of plywood. I'm going to paste my image. If it's gonna work. Paste my image right in here, and I'm gonna go over to image trace. If you don't have this quick action available right in here, you're gonna come up to your object menu here, and you're going to go to, you're going to, you can crowd image trace right here and tell it to make. Now within the image trace setup right in here, what I would tend for you guys to say that you're going to want to use is the silhouettes properties here. Okay, so we're going to illustrate, there we go. This is going to give us a pretty good black and white type image, which is really what we want since we're going to be doing a vector pocket cut right in here. Okay, you can play with these parameters in here in order to get you your best image, but then once you're done, what you want to do is expand. That's going to convert this into from an image into an object that has vectors on it. I can then scale this to be the size that I want it to be. It's not going to have any distortion as I increase the size. And this should then match what it is that I've got for my final output. So if I know, for instance, that I want this thing to be perfectly centered, I can type 96.5 divided by 2, 48.5 divided by 2, and that'll place that exactly in the center. If I want my width to be exactly 65 inches, I would recommend you want to have those guys linked. Tell it 65 and it'll adjust it accordingly. Okay. Once I've got this, I'm going to save this. I'll save this onto the desktop. I'll go desktop. I'll just call this Nike. Okay. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to go into a... Alright, so then once we have our Illustrator file saved to the desktop here, we're going to go into Aspire. We're going to create a new file with setting up our job size here. Again, if we are creating a full sheet of plywood, we type in our 96.5, 48.5, put in our thickness, and set our datum point to this lower left corner. You can play around with the appearance or the modeling resolution if you need to. I tend to leave those guys alone just because I'm mostly concerned about it generating the correct toolpath, and neither of these tends to have any sort of impact on the toolpaths. Tell it OK. And then we've got this set over here. I like to lock my toolbar menu out, so I put this guy out and pin that. The next thing that we need to do is bring in our vectors. Rather than creating all of our vectors, if we wanted to, we could create stuff in here, and that can be helpful. I tend to want to create my stuff in Illustrator. It tends to be a lot easier to do that. So I'm going to come in here, go File, Import, Vectors. I'll go to where I have my vector saved in my AI file. Click on that to open it, and it'll import it. You'll notice that it'll bring it down towards my origin point right here. So if I wanted to bring that back towards the center where I had it before, I'm going to tell it to move selected objects. Having that center anchor selected, I'll move that then to be in the center points where we had before, our 48.25 and our 24.25. Tell it to apply it and then close. If I click outside of here, you'll see that these vectors are all black. That means that they're not selected for anything. If I wanted to highlight them all, they become selected. That's going to be important when we come over here to our toolpaths. We can either have them not selected now, or we can select them and select our toolpath. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Just know that the pink ones are going to be the ones that it is looking at whenever it is applying any sort of action, whether that's moving it, rotating it, or applying a toolpath to it. If we were going to be just carving this partially through, leaving part of our material through there, and we wanted just a flat bottom along that, we'd be creating a pocket toolpath. We'd set our starting depth to be 0, that way it's at the top of the sheet of plywood, and we'd set our cut depth to be 3/8, or whatever it is that we wanted it to be. 3/8 cuts that halfway through. We're going to select our tool here. If we have a tool that is not listed already, for instance this 375 down cut is one that I added, we'd come in here and tell it new, tell it what type of tool path it is that we have, and then put in the information that we need for that particular tool. We're going to cancel this. With this toolpath here, the feed rates and the step over are things that I pulled in from the Amana Tool website. If you go look at the Amana Tool bits, they'll talk a little bit more about what is an appropriate feed rate, plunge rate, etc. for the tool, given the number of flutes, the depth with which you are cutting, and the speed with which you are turning the bit. All those things are also going to vary slightly depending upon what material you're using. So these ones happen to work well as far as feeds and speeds for the 3/4 inch plywood that I have and for my particular machine and the particular material that I'm cutting. So if you're going to use these with a little bit of at your own risk. If this is the tool that I'm going to want, I'm going to tell it OK. I'm going to tell it I like to use the offset here. I'm going to select my vectors that I want, and then it's just as simple as pressing calculate. And you'll notice that it has calculated these vectors out. If I wanted to preview what this would look like, I'll tell it to preview all toolpaths, and it'll show me what my sign would then look like. So that would be a pocket mill right in there, and it would be great if you were planning on doing something where you wanted to, for instance, paint this and then mill through to expose the wood, or if you were going to fill this or do any sort of inlay, that'd be the type of toolpath that I would use for that. If you're doing pieces that are going to be going together, you can use that to do some sort of dado to allow the next piece to slide into that then as well. If you were to be wanting to cut this all out into a single shape, the next thing that the type of toolpath that you'd want to use would be a profile cut. So I'm going to tell this to reset. I'm going to come back to my vectors, and I'm going to tell it I want this to be a profile. We're going to tell it to cut. I like to go slightly deeper than what my actual material is. So when you're doing that, you'll want to make sure that you have a sacrifice board set up on your mill, or make sure that you are not drilling into or milling into the actual machine itself. So this is slightly deeper than the thickness of the material that we're cutting. I've got it set for 1 pass. You can edit the number of passes here using different bits and different types of settings. This may be something that you'll want to double check to whether or not you're doing multiple passes or if you're going to do 1 single pass. Again, those are all going to be determined by your material and the bit and machine that you're using. When you are cutting this and you're doing a profile, there are 3 different options. Outside would cut along this outer edge here, leaving the vector itself. Inside would cut along the inner side, leaving the vector itself. And on would be following exactly on the vector. For this one here, if I was to be cutting this out and making a sign out of these different components, I would want to take the outside. The next thing that I would recommend you do is come down here and go add tabs to toolpath. Tell us to edit tabs. This will allow you to either place a constant number of tabs through here, either using a distance, or you can just add tabs on manually by coming in here and placing these. This will help you have the ability to keep your piece attached to the actual work area rather than rattling around as it's trying to finish cuts. Something to note, if you have, for instance, if we had a really wide bit and it was cutting most of this, if I don't place a tab correspondingly here, when it goes to cut along this vector, if this tab would kind of extend into here, it's going to cut that tab all the way off then. So when you're doing ones that are close to each other like this, good idea to make sure that you have vector or tabs set up on the vector nearest to that then as well. Okay. Then once I have all of my tabs set, simply hit close. Again, tell it to calculate. It's going to give me this warning that I'm cutting thicker than the actual material thickness. Telling it okay. You'll see that I get these different toolpaths in here. If I preview that, you can see I get a through cut and I end up with my Nike sign. Okay. If I was to be doing any sort of V-carve or a drill, same type of stuff right in there, I tend to avoid using these because I can end up creating these utilizing these 4 toolpaths right in here. These ones have their advantages. They're just ones that I don't particularly use. So the only other one that I would say that I do use would be either the 3D roughing and 3D finishing, and that would be importing STLs. That's a whole nother ball game as far as setting up and what it is that you want to do. So once we've got all of our toolpaths calculated and we're happy with how they are, we can do a couple of things. We're in the preview toolpaths. We have just previewed that. We can take a look at seeing how long this is going to take. So for instance, using those feed rates and the path right in here, it would estimate that this would take approximately 7 minutes to cut out. As long as that's something that's acceptable for what you have for your particular time frame, you would tell it then that you would want to save it. Make sure you've got these toolpaths selected if you've got multiple toolpaths. I like to tell it to preview or to set all of them to be into one file. And then we are using the Shopbot inch for our particular one. So SBP, tell it save toolpaths. Save it wherever it is that you're going to save it, and then it's just a matter of bringing that over into your Shopbot material or your Shopbot console and running it then in there. So pretty quick, pretty simple. You can get your stuff cut out pretty quickly and easily once you kind of understand how to get your vectors into Aspire.